Welcome back for another week of this ride. I am starting today with the trigger warning that should come with today's passages, but does not, because it wasn't a thing when the Bible was transcribed. So today we are going to be talking about rape. We are going to be talking about, as we kind of have been really, the diminishment of women in general. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If that means skipping this week, that's okay. Do what you need to do. So this week we're actually going to work backwards and start with a passage from the New Testament because it's a little less complicated. It's going to help us ease in to some of the more difficult themes. And though I also would argue that this passage in 1 Corinthians actually does tie quite well, unfortunately, to Dinah's story. So, in his letter to the church in Corinth, Paul included this section on worship guidelines. That is an important thing to remember when reading this text. In fact, I think it's the lack of the context that has allowed this text to be so misapplied for so long. The church in Corinth is a developing community. It's a church without a constant guide. They are naturally influenced by other faith communities around them, other faiths and other faith communities around them. That in and of itself causes difficulties. So Paul is writing a letter to check in and to remind them of some guidelines, to kind of rein them in a bit from a season of competition, one-upsmanship, if you will, to something different. So he starts with a reminder that the purpose of worship, as far as it relates to the community, needs to be built upon a foundation of building one another up. That's key. Those who speak in tongues are instructed to be silent if no one is present to interpret the message. Because what is the point if there's no one there to interpret? Prophets are then restricted in the number who speak so that what they say might be received without distraction. So in other words, rather than having prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet, teaching after teaching after teaching, which gets people a little confused about who are we supposed to be listening to, let's limit that. Let's rein that in. Paul then adds, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. Note that in the reference to speaking in tongues or in prophecies, speaking in tongues or prophecies, Paul does not limit these directions to a specific gender. That's important. Then we enter into this parenthetical nightmare that has and continues to cause so much harm towards women and their roles in both family and the church. First, it is parenthetical. It's an aside. Maybe because Paul thought it was obvious, or maybe because he was simply affirming something he knew would occur. Maybe he was sending a direct message only to the reader of the letter. We don't know. We don't know if the reader of the letter shared this parenthetical part with the congregation. They might have, maybe not. Second, nowhere in this section does Paul state that these are God-given guidelines. This goes back to what we talked about last week, where Paul is sharing with this community what he believes for this community in this time. That's important. Third, remember Paul's full context. This is a man that we have talked about many weeks who worked alongside women in full ministry consistently and without hesitation. He didn't change his mind for Corinth, and he didn't suddenly decide women were not called to prophesy or preach. Fourth, language matters as much as context. As Ashley M. Wilcox, author of the Women's Lectionary, reminds us, these words in their original language can equally be translated as wives interrupting their husbands during the worship. So obviously that still sounds awful, though as someone who kind of despises interrupting, I also kind of get it. But I think there's something deeper here. If so many people have questions during worship, maybe the issue isn't with the wives who interrupt their husbands to gain clarity. Maybe it's actually the fact that whatever is happening during worship is not making sense to everyone present. So circle back then to the start. Tie it all together, and now we have more context as to why Paul provides the Corinth congregation with guidelines for worship components and limitations, including for wives to not interrupt their husbands' learning to ask their own questions. Perhaps, and I'd argue the directive to limit speaking in tongues to when an interpreter is also present is evidence for this. Perhaps these guidelines are meant to increase the chances of eliminating the need for questions during the service, because to put in these limitations actually decreases opportunity for misunderstanding. It provides greater clarity. So let's shift to Dinah. In this part of the Israelite narrative, Jacob and his wives and his children have left Laban, see previous weeks. And along the way, Jacob and Esau reunited. Now, Jacob and the family are settled in a city of Canaan. We don't know how long they've been there when this moment occurs, but it's long enough that Dinah feels safe and familiar enough to leave the comfort of their designated area, land. If you look just before the beginning of chapter 34, this is land that Jacob has purchased. Dinah feels perfectly comfortable to leave the area, to go and meet with the women of the town. But this time, things take a very traumatizing turn. The NRSV writes it this way: when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. In short, a man of significant power and influence sees a woman that he wants and takes her. Now, to be fair to the original language, the word the NRSV and multiple other translations translate as rape can also be translated as slept with her and humiliated her, which they say implies consensual premarital sex. First, regardless of which interpretation you believe, it cannot be ignored that it is focused upon the act of the male, to say nothing about the impact or consent from the woman. Second, the dominant evidence does indicate that it was, in fact, rape. I'll say it again. A man of power and influence sees a woman he wants and takes her. Somehow the story we're living in 2024 is right here in Genesis 34. What follows in the remainder of this text is a continuous downhill disaster that begins with this: and his, Shechem's, soul was drawn to Dinah. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. And then to his dad, he says, "Get me this girl to be my wife." Issue 1, he raped her and then spoke tenderly to her because he loved her. Siblings, this is gaslighting 101. Issue 2, girl. Dinah is a person. I don't know her age at this time, but she is a person with a name. Use it. And issue 3, this phrase, "Get me this girl." Even if you refuse to read this story as a situation of rape, even if you choose to believe it was somehow consensual premarital sex and Shechem was just doing the right thing by asking to marry her, do you notice the missing piece? It's Dinah. Dinah isn't in the story. She's erased from her own traumatic story. Her story, in fact, is turned then into a violent massacre of nation versus nation, father versus sons, brothers who take on the role of protector. Yet no one talks to Dinah. No one checks in on Dinah. No one asks what she needs. No one offers to just get out of the land. Just leave. Instead, in the name of protection, they heap trauma upon trauma. And then, let's not forget, the brothers who are supposedly defending her honor indirectly call her a whore. That's the NRSV wording. Let's be clear, nowhere in this text is there any indication for the validity of that word in this context. Dinah is erased, and you know what? God is too. God is not consulted. God does not speak to Jacob, or to Simeon and Levi. God does not direct any of this. So where is God? God is with Dinah. God is surrounding Dinah with the women she needs, while Jacob is negotiating the marriage of his traumatized daughter to her rapist without her consent. God steps in where Jacob should be. Today, branches of Christianity remain in which marital rape is common. Physical and emotional abuse are justified as the right of the headship. I want to be clear that God condones none of it. So how did it get so twisted? It goes back to Dinah and then to the women of Corinth. Decisions about their bodies and minds were made for them without consultation. 2024, right here in Genesis 34. Dinah's voice was silenced. She was removed from her own story, knocked from center stage to side note, so that the fighting and the posturing were in the spotlight. By the time the women of Corinth attend worship generations later, the voices of women are still silenced. In both cases, they are silenced by men of power. In both cases, they are silenced to turn the tide of the story. In both cases, they are silenced without taking the time to determine what is needed by the ones actually impacted. What did Dinah need to feel whole again? What did Dinah need to feel cleansed from the shame that was thrust upon her, that was never hers to take on, but was nonetheless put upon her by the societal and religious constructs of the day, she is shamed for what he did. And him? Two dads try to figure out how to make peace and give him the woman that he wants. And the women of Corinth, what did they need to make worship more accessible to them? Perhaps they knew that there were women who traveled with Paul, who were prophets, who preached, and they just wanted more of them in their worship. Perhaps they needed more God and less humanity. The women of Corinth were never meant to be used as scapegoats to eliminate the presence of women in the church, then or now. It's an irresponsible and harmful reading of the text. Dinah endured hell. That chapter should be all about her. Her rape should not be uplifted as the reason for an ensuing battle and massacre. It's dismissive. It's harmful and irresponsible. It's reprehensible. It is disgusting. When I started this self-imposed preaching challenge, I didn't know why the Spirit led me into it. But on days like today, it is abundantly clear. For far too long, these stories were twisted to cause layer upon layer of additional harm, and it's time for that to stop. No more. She is called, and she will never be silenced again. Thank you for joining me on this ride. Thank you for being brave enough to open your hearts to things that are often missed in traditional preaching within the four walls of a church bound by religious law and structure that most of the time I don't think God would be behind. Let's keep this ride going. Subscribe, like, comment, share. Let other people know about this journey. Bring them along, and let's see what we can do. Be well.